Hi, I'm Dr. Liz Carter, and welcome to my free three-part series, Figuring Out Your Food Allergies. In this first video, we're going to cover how to know if you have food allergies and really get into the definition of what they are. In this part 2, we're going to look at my favorite way to treat food allergies, which is also free and pretty easy to do. And in the third part, we're going to look at some of the most common issues I see people have while treating food allergies and what to do about that. Okay, so let's dive right in today to part 1 of our series. How do I know if I have a food allergy? I think this is a very common question that comes up for people. There's a lot kind of floating around out there nowadays about food allergies. I think gluten in particular has come up a lot. But we also start to hear more about others like dairy, eggs, all kinds of things. So it is a question that I think a lot of people are asking, and whether or not this is valid, right? I think there's a lot of thought process around, I don't know if gluten allergy is a real thing, celiac disease seems to be, but maybe not these other allergies. What are people talking about? And then we also have an issue with the usage of terms, which we'll get into. Here, actually, I'll show you what we're gonna cover today, and that'll explain a little bit. So we'll be defining allergy, sensitivity, and intolerance. These all mean different things. And they're all relevant to understand. And if I'm being honest, there's a lot of kind of misunderstanding of the terms even within the naturopathic profession itself, or allergy profession, right, as Western medicine allergy docs. And then also the terms are kind of used inconsistently. So I'm going to do my best to define them as how I understand them. And in my career, this is how they've been defined. Other people might feel differently. So feel free to do your own research and see what you find out there. This video is kind of, a jumping off point for you to really start discovering more. And there's plenty of amazing, wonderful resources out there that I'll also have links to at below the video for you to check out. And I will introduce them to you as well at the end of the series. So have no fear. There will be a lot of ways besides this video to look into a little bit further information for yourself, because there's a lot out there and it can be confusing. So allergy, sensitivity, and intolerance, and then we'll look at the typical symptoms that happen with each of these, because they're not all the same, and I think this is where people get really confused as well. And then common causes of these allergies and intolerances, which of course some can be food, and surprisingly some are not food. Sometimes it's what's in food or a few other factors. So we'll get into that and kind of parsing it all out, really trying to clarify exactly what's going on here. And then we'll also find out the truth about food allergy testing, which is interesting, right? I think that's what we all think of, where, oh my gosh, I might have food allergies, so let me try out some food allergy testing. That will surely tell me the answer. And, we'll learn today a little bit farther in how it can be helpful, and then how it can be not helpful and even detrimental as well. Food allergy tests are not the end-all, be-all of understanding your food allergies, even though it's kind of touted that way, because it's a very convenient way to get you to pay $160 or more to do this, to test 100 foods or so, and even more if you're getting testing at like skin testing at an allergist's office. So I'm not a huge fan of food allergy tests. They do have kind of a limited applicability, which can be great, and it can kind of get people jumping off to start with looking into this process, but definitely not the end-all be-all. So I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I tend to do that. So let's back it up, and let's start off at the beginning here. And I have to warn you guys, there's a lot of slides, I guess, visuals or slides here, to go through today. So just like hang in there with me. There's going to be a lot of information in this one. The other two videos, there'll be information, but maybe not quite as like visual or slide heavy here. Good. Okay, so we're going to start with the first one. We're going to define a food allergy. So a food allergy is immune mediated. So I've written over here AGAB, so that might not make a lot of sense to you, but it's an antigen antibody reaction. So that means your immune system has to react. in an allergy, right? In a food allergy specifically. That makes sense, right? That is the same thing that happens with pollen and other things we're allergic to in the environment. Your immune system sees this foreign substance and it decides, hey, this is not supposed to be here. I am going to attack it, right? So that's part of it, right? The antigen is the little invader guy, and the antibody is the immune protein marker that your body forms to combat that. So that's very convenient. In a lot of food allergy testing, we are testing for one of these. It's called IG, or immunoglobulin proteins. So food allergy, that way, when it's defined this way, it's an immediate response, or IgE. So there are a lot of different types of immune responses in the body, which is wonderful because our immune system is fabulous, right? We have to fight off a whole bunch of different kinds of things. But an immediate response is one that has very significant and potentially severe symptoms. So we've got all these things listed out here, right? We've got swelling of the face, tongue, throat, and lips. That sounds pretty intense and scary. We've got wheezing or difficulty breathing. Literally, kind of our throat can swell up, and same with the bronchioles in our lungs. Hives or itching skin, right? So a lot of heat and irritation happening, or vomiting and diarrhea. And these are all symptoms of anaphylaxis, right? And that's a big kind of word that it's pretty scary. It means that there's this really intense hypersensitivity response. This is the type of response you hear about with people who maybe have peanut allergies, or kids, or people that have to carry around EpiPens with them. The IgE response is that immediate hypersensitivity response, and that is technically what a food allergy is. So you can already see that, hey, like, oh, maybe I've heard from my naturopath I have food allergies or other things, but I don't have that type of response, right? So this is where the term food allergy is very, very often misused, and I am guilty of that too. I often say food allergy just for the simplicity of things. It's what people most understand, and there are some other things we'll deal with that are allergic responses, but in a little bit different way. So food allergy is kind of this blanket term, and really there's 3 different reactions at least that we have. So technically, a food allergy is truly this really intense, potentially life-threatening response. So I'll flip you over here. So the most common reaction foods, sorry, my slides slipped down a little bit. They're a little too heavy for this display. We'll leave it here for now. The most common reactions are milk, eggs, fish, shellfish. I think shellfish, it's one of those that you see in comedy shows or movies where people swell up and then they can't breathe, and it's kind of, it's meant as a joke or a comic relief at that point. So they get hives as well. So that's a really common depiction of a shellfish allergy. Wheat, soy, peanuts, and tree nuts, right? This is where, the airlines stop carrying peanuts as snacks, or you have to ask for them specially, and then people needing nut-free kind of dishes and issues. So these are the most common foods that cause that really intense, potentially life-threatening reaction. And it's no joke, right? This is a big deal. So food allergies are really, really intense and important to recognize here. And there's been an increase in prevalence in them in the last few years, which is interesting, showing that our immune systems are just a little more reactive, and there's a whole that's a whole nother video to get into about that. But so I think these are the most easily quantifiable food allergies that people can understand, right? If you have such an intense physical symptom that you can't breathe, people think that's legitimate, right? People understand. There's not the same kind of mentality with a peanut allergy as there is with a gluten allergy, right? Where so I think this is an interesting one to look at, the technical definition of a food allergy. Okay, so let's get into, move this back up here, food sensitivities. So this is probably the least well-defined term out of the 3, out of the allergy, the sensitivity, and the intolerance. So this is the murkiest, and this is the best I could do to kind of like tease it out for you guys. But as you'll find as we go through this, a lot of things with food allergies are not really clear. But that's okay, because it's a big learning experience, and it's super, super helpful to have to kind of muddle through it on your own, as awful as that sounds. But hopefully we're clarifying a little bit so there's a little bit less muddling. So a food sensitivity is another immune response. So we did talk about the IgE and the hypersensitivity reaction, but your body can make a whole bunch of other types of immunoglobulins. So these are a few examples. So IgG, which is often a delayed sensitivity reaction, IgA and IgM. IgM is also delayed, and IgA is kind of specific to our mucous membranes in the body, so like GI tract, throat, sinuses, urinary tract, all kinds of things. So we're not going to get into that too much, but I do have delayed reactions down here. So this is why these can be a little murkier and more confusing. If you have a true food allergy and an IgE hypersensitivity reaction, you are going to know it immediately, maybe within 15 minutes or an hour. With these guys, since they're delayed, it's very hard to figure out if there's an issue, because the delayed means up to 72 hours delayed, which is a big deal, right? That's really, really difficult to actually pin down what has been happening in the past 72 hours. You've probably eaten a lot in the meantime. So it's very difficult to say, was it the dairy I ate this morning? Was it wheat? Is this, and this is where the confusion around food allergies comes from, where it's like, how could this possibly be an issue? I didn't have anything happen right after I ate. But the truth is, most food allergies are delayed, that they don't happen right away. And I think that's where it's very difficult to understand as someone who has food allergies or sensitivities or intolerances when you're just beginning to learn about them. And then it's very difficult for other people to understand as well, because they associate this food allergy with anaphylactic shock type of thing. So, right, I've written here that these are much more common than IgE reactions, right? When, especially in my career, I have a very different viewpoint of that. I rarely see IgE reactions, and I rarely test people for them, because if you have an IgE reaction, one of those hypersensitivity reactions, you are going to know it. You are going to find that out pretty early in life, because it only takes being exposed to a food twice to really develop that hypersensitivity reaction. So usually what I'm working with people is figuring out sensitivities and intolerances. And again, those are much more common to come up, so and be an issue. And we'll kind of get into a little bit of like maybe why that might be happening for people. So food sensitivity, also immune mediated, but not that hypersensitivity IgE reaction. Okay, so there we go. So common food sensitivity reaction foods, right? So we've got a little bit more exhaustive list. That's not saying that the IgE reactions can't involve these. It's just less common. So we've got some good overlap here, right? We've got gluten, dairy, soy, corn, sugar, eggs. I kind of tacked on citrus there. Sorry, I remembered a couple a little bit late. Yeast. Nightshades can be a big one. So nightshades are potatoes, tomatoes, eggplant, peppers, usually, that whole family. I know, that's, there's a lot of really fun foods in there. So you can have delayed immune reactions. So usually IgG delayed reactions to these foods. And you can have different ones as well. These are just the most common. And oftentimes I see if people are sensitive to some of these big ones, that's usually the core of the sensitivity, and any other smaller sensitivities do resolve when we start to treat these core foods. And that's big, right? These foods are a large part of our diet a lot of the time. Soy and corn, if you're eating more processed foods, they end up in everything because we've got high fructose corn syrup, and then soybean oil. It's just ubiquitous in processed foods. Even some natural and organic foods will use really low quality oils, not often high fructose corn syrup, because that is GMO, and GMO foods are not allowed in organic foods, but you will see organic soy things in there. So so this is kind of where you see a lot of people starting to look at a wider issue of foods that they might have reactions to. And we're going to skip over common symptoms for food sensitivities, and we're going to hit that when we talk about food intolerances as well, because most of them overlap quite a bit. So so we'll just move on forward. Man, my slides are having a little trouble staying up today. It's okay. It's a lot of paper weight there. Okay, so food intolerances. So this is our third type of food issue. So it does not involve the immune system. That is the takeaway for a food intolerance. No immune system activation directly, right? So it can activate things indirectly over time, but it's not this antigen antibody reaction. And that's why this can get even more confusing, because almost all of the food allergy tests that we have available, either through your conventional Western medicine allergist or your naturopath, test for the antibody antigen reaction. So we'll get into that a little bit further when we talk about testing. These are really up to you to kind of figure out and see if you're sensitive to. So there is no good test. There is something we'll talk about when we get there. It's a very specialized type of testing that can be massively helpful for people. But most of the time for food intolerances, it's kind of you figuring things out on your own here. So often activated indirectly with the immune system. And so a food intolerance means that the body cannot process part of the food. So it literally does not have kind of the gear to break down part of that food. So that can come from a few different things. It could lack an enzyme, it could be lacking a nutrient, it could be lacking the proper bacteria. We hear a lot about probiotics and the importance of balancing out your good flora. Those really do play a part in breaking down food sometimes. So that's part of where the food intolerance comes from, is that you literally don't have the tools to break it down for whatever reason. And there are several reasons that can play into that. So the most common would be with, we do hear about lactose intolerance, right? That one's actually labeled correctly because we literally do not have the lactase enzyme, which breaks down the milk sugar lactose. And so that's common in about 70% of the population, supposedly. Only Northern Europeans are really supposed to produce enough lactase to break down that lactose sugar in milk or soft dairy products usually. So I think that's the most clear example of actually lacking an enzyme. It's kind of one-to-one, but unfortunately most food intolerances are not quite that clear. So, okay, let's move on to, common intolerance foods. So you can see we have some really similar foods to the sensitivity list, right? So we've got dairy, gluten, corn, soy, citrus, eggs, nightshades, sugar, and then we can get into a few other things. Additives, right? That's interesting in foods. Additives, colorings, preservatives. Why would we have the machinery to break that down in the body, right? They're not natural. So people can develop intolerances to them, right? They can develop this reaction, and we'll get into what symptoms come up on the next slide here. They can develop this reaction to these additives or inorganic, unnatural byproducts that are in processed food in our food supply nowadays. This also applies to GMO foods with lots of Roundup that's layered in to the foods itself. And again, I think I mentioned this in a previous video, but they're finding a lot of the gluten sensitivity can be directly related to the chemical found in Roundup, and that's actually what people are reacting to. So interesting new stuff coming out all the time about the food issues. So additives, right? Fructose, that's interesting, right? Not the same as sugar. Fructose and glucose are completely different pathways, or partially different pathways in your body, metabolism. Amines sometimes, and salicylates. So these are all little kind of byproducts of, amines come up a lot in fermentation, salicylates come up a lot in onion, garlic kind of foods, among others. It's surprising when you look into a list of salicylates. So for some people, they just literally do not have the capacity to break these down. And the question there is that genetic, right? Like a lactose intolerance, where we just don't produce the enzyme? Or is it from something environmentally that's been going on that's actually affecting our digestive machinery and not really allowing us to digest properly? So that comes into play with food intolerances and food sensitivities, because we have the potential of activating that immune system unnecessarily to those foods that we normally wouldn't react to. Okay, so yeah, so complicated picture overall. I know. Okay, so let's check out the common symptoms of food allergies and food intolerances. So we can see a lot of GI related things can come up. So diarrhea, you often see a little bit more, from my clinical experience, I'm speaking, a little bit more diarrhea, which makes sense if you literally lack the machinery to deal with the intolerance. Your body is just going to say, hey, I am getting this out of here, it needs to move through, I can't deal, right? Whereas constipation, I think, is a little bit more common in a sensitivity reaction where you've got a lot of inflammation happening, and we'll get a little bit more into inflammation in a bit here. But the extra inflammation will kind of draw moisture out of the stool and into small intestine or large intestine. So we'll dehydrate the stool effectively, and that's kind of where you get this constipation reaction. Again, that's what I've seen clinically, not always a one-to-one. Gas and bloating, of course, because if you have an immune reaction or you don't have the correct enzymes to break things down or mechanisms, things are going to sit in the GI longer than they should and ferment a little bit and cause this gas and bloating. Nausea is also another symptom, as well as cramping, which can go along with gas and bloating. So I think that these are pretty easy to understand symptoms when it comes to food allergies, right? People understand that the GI is involved because you are putting food into your GI, pretty one-to-one. However, this is a very, very small part of what symptoms can come up with food intolerances and food sensitivities. So this is where it gets interesting when we look into this comprehensive list of common symptoms. So we also get headaches. I've seen many people have migraines related to food sensitivities or intolerances. I've seen, foggy headed thinking where you just kind of can't quite connect the dots, you're a little bit out of it, that type of thing. I've seen anxiety, depression, and anger related to food allergies. I've had a few patients who get kind of unbelievably angry when they have gluten, which is very interesting. And I've also had a few with gluten and dairy that have this major anxiety response where they feel like they've had like 18 cups of coffee and are just wired. So it's really fascinating the farther reaching effects these foods have on our nervous system sometimes. A lot of respiratory issues are actually related to food allergies, or can be. And I'm sorry, I said allergies. That's just kind of how I refer to them. In this case, I do mean sensitivities and intolerances. I'll try to catch myself with that, but it might not always happen. So asthma, sinusitis, right? So sinus infections are a big one that can happen. PND stands for postnasal drip. Ear infections, a lot of times for little kids, dairy is a big issue in terms of a sensitivity with ear infections. Little pearl there for you. And bronchitis, so even more kind of lung issues coming up. Skin issues, especially eczema and psoriasis, are very likely related to food allergy issues. Skin almost is never about the skin. It's always about something more deeply rooted, and it almost always starts in the GI. So let's move on to even more common symptoms. I know this is quite the list, right? So joint and muscle pain, which is interesting. And I'm not talking about, if you have a trauma or you went to the gym, of course you might be a little bit sore, or if you overextended something. This is more, persistent joint and muscle pain. Maybe it takes you longer to recover from the gym than you think it should. Or you wake up with aching joints and you're not really sure what's going on. Oftentimes it's symmetrical, so it'll be both wrists or both ankles or both knees, that type of thing that comes up. Insomnia can happen from these food allergies. Excuse me, again, most often from their effect on the nervous system. Sorry, food sensitivities or intolerances. And then low energy or fatigue, of course, can happen, and unexplained weight gain can be a big one for people where it just kind of adds up over time and you're like, I don't know what happened, I didn't change anything. Food sensitivities and intolerances can be at the root of that. And I do just want to address something, this exhaustive symptom list that came up. This food sensitivities and intolerances are certainly not the only reason these things might be happening. And of course, if you have these things happening, definitely, talk to your healthcare practitioner, see what they have to say, get some blood work, get some tests, rule things out, right? Make sure that there's nothing more serious going on. In terms of these symptoms, I'm never talking about acute, it's always chronic. These are chronic issues that people have come up over months and years of their life that they just adapt to, and they just assume that's the way life is and there's no way it could possibly be any different. And oftentimes, if that's your picture, there is a food sensitivity or intolerance component to it. Not always, again, and this is just a video, please, check in with your local practitioner and see what they have to say, and do some more research on your own and feel like if you really fit that picture. This covers a lot of symptoms people can have. Food sensitivities and tolerance testing or treatment is clearly not a cure-all, and that's not what I want it to make it out to be. Do I see great results from people in my practice who follow a treatment plan and address their food sensitivities and intolerances? Yes. Are there a lot of random symptoms that end up clearing up? Yes. It does work and it does help if that is the root. So that's really the key here, is figuring out if the food symptoms are at the root of the issue for you. It's surprising a lot of times how much of it can be, but again, that's where you want to check in with your local practitioner. And again, if any of these come up acutely, that's a very different thing than if it's chronic or over the long term. So just wanted to mention that for you there. Okay, so my big question here was, can these all be related to food allergies? This seems crazy. My answer is yes. Seriously. They really all can be related. And I'm sure you're wondering why. I don't really understand why, because they're just going through the GI tract. What is the deal here? How can they possibly affect my mood or my nerves or my joints or my muscles, or my fatigue level? It just doesn't make any sense, right? So that comes down to this one lovely thing that we have in our body, inflammation. So inflammation gets a really bad rap, and I'm sure I've talked about this in a few of my other videos. So inflammation is crucial to our immune system. It's crucial to our healing process. It is not something we want to squash or manage with Tylenol or other anti-inflammatories. We want to get to the root of why this inflammation is happening, right? And then we want to address that and bring that inflammation load down naturally. Inflammation is telling us there's something wrong. And then we need to figure out what the heck is going on, right? We need to listen to our body and figure out what is at the root of this inflammation. And oftentimes, extra inflammation is at the root of definitely food sensitivities and sometimes food intolerances, depending on what's going on with the food intolerances. So let's look at a little bit of how this actually happens and the contributing factors. So this is kind of the process here that we can have. So let's start with food intolerances over here on this side. So the things that can relate to food intolerances. We've got things like dairy, gluten, eggs, maybe we're missing some enzymes, maybe we're missing some bacteria, fructose, maybe we just don't have that enzyme at all. Additives, right? We don't have any machinery to break down these chemicals in our body. So food intolerances over time, they will lead to inflammation because they're not something that our body really knows how to deal with and break down properly. So they're going to sit there and they're going to cause irritation. And irritation causes inflammation. And that's kind of this secondary recruitment of the immune system where it's not a direct recruitment. There's not an antigen-antibody response. But if there's an irritant, our body is going to come into that area with inflammation, which is part of an immune system response, and try to clean it up, right? That's what we do with inflammation. Inflammation recruits white blood cells and other immune cells to come in and say, hey, there's a problem here. We need to clean this up. We need to get this out of here. So We can see that inflammation may be created by these food intolerances. And we can also see that inflammation is created by other things, right? We've got environmental toxins, which we all tend to be very exposed to a ton of nowadays with air fresheners and PCBs, crap in plastic. You know, it's all over the place. There's tons of different things, right, that contribute to our environmental toxins. We're just surrounded by chemicals. And then we've got allergens, right? Environmental allergens like grass or pollen, trees, that type of thing. And then we've got stress that leads to inflammation, of course. I think we all can understand that. And then we've also got pathogenic bacteria, right? Maybe you pick something up with something you shouldn't have eaten or had to drink, something like that. And then processed foods, right, cause inflammation because of the weird additives and chemicals that are in there. So we can see that all of these things contribute to inflammation. And if we've already got a high inflammatory load, and then we've got some foods here that maybe we can't quite deal with, it's going to create an intolerance, right? It's going to create a reaction to that issue. So I hope that makes sense, that they both kind of inform each other on this spectrum, where inflammation, extra and way too much inflammation, can lead to food intolerances. So sometimes addressing these issues over here, which often have to do with maybe potentially food sensitivities as well, will bring down food intolerances. Or if we bring down food intolerances, we'll decrease our overall inflammation load in the body. So what can happen with this cycle is that it leads to something called leaky gut. And I'm going to bring this back around to why all those symptoms happen. So when we get leaky gut, what's happened is we've created enough inflammation and irritation in that GI that we've taken like the cells that make up the GI lining. They're usually really tightly bound together, so things aren't going to get through, right? The proteins that are kind of weird and maybe not totally digested because we've got a food intolerance, so we can't really break it down all the way, those are going to stay on the outside of the GI lining. But over time, if we've got a lot of inflammation, we've recruited more moisture, right? There's always swelling and irritation there. Those junctions get a little bit of gap between them. So, and when that happens, these proteins, these partially digested proteins or allergens can actually leak across the GI membrane. And that is why it's called leaky gut. And then we've got these weird proteins that are partially broken down that kind of look like gluten or they kind of look like dairy that leak across into our bloodstream, and then they deposit in other parts of our body. So this is how these food sensitivities and intolerances can actually migrate and affect other systems of the body. And it really depends on who you are and what your susceptible systems are, where they land. You know, for some people it stays in the mucous membranes and it goes right to their sinuses, and they're more prone to allergies. Some people it goes to the joints. Some people it goes to the nervous system where they have those mood issues or a lot of fatigue. So it's just really, really depends on where those susceptible points are. And the food. Different foods have different affinities for things. Gluten tends to look a lot like the thyroid, and this is where we get a very strong reaction in people who have Hashimoto's, Hashimoto's thyroiditis. There's a kind of partially broken down gluten protein that looks very similar to the thyroid gland. So if your immune system is trying to get out this weird gluten protein and then the thyroid looks similar, the immune system's going to start attacking the thyroid. So again, the leaky gut can really lead to a lot of these issues with foods, and then over time, if it happens chronically enough, it can lead to autoimmune issues. And I'm sure I will do a whole video on that at some point because it's a big deal. But this really is the core of that. So we want to learn how to heal up that gut, right? And remove these irritating factors. So let's look into some testing. Okay, we've got a lot of stuff on here. So how do we actually test for these food allergies? So this is really important, or sensitivities or intolerances. This is really important to address because this is a really common misunderstanding point that people have. So we've got the type of reaction, got the common method of testing, and then what does this common method of testing test? So looking at a true food allergy, again, that's that hypersensitivity, potential anaphylactic shock. It doesn't always go that far, but you do have those symptoms come up. So looking at the traditional food allergy test, you go to an allergist, right, a Western doc, and they do either a skin prick test, where they test all these different allergens on your back usually, and if it reacts, that means you have a hypersensitivity reaction, or a RAST test, which is a blood test that also tests IgE. So this is the main point of misunderstanding that I see in people when they come to me and they say, oh, I've had allergy testing, or I've had food allergy testing and I don't have any, or, or it's grass or something, because they often test for environmental and foods at the same time, and their food testing is often quite minimal. So that's not really telling me anything. It's telling me that you do not have an anaphylactic or hypersensitivity IgE immediate reaction to foods, right? And again, that's something that you would usually know on your own because they are severe or have intense symptoms come along. So when you've been to get skin allergy testing, that is not actually testing a large part or the most common type of food allergies or food sensitivity reactions. That tests the other immune response, the delayed sensitivity, where you have all these other random symptoms that come up that are very difficult to associate with foods. So that's a big one. So when we look at actually testing for food sensitivities, this is where something you get usually from a naturopath or a natural healthcare practitioner. It's a food allergy panel. It usually tests for around 100 foods, and it tests, usually you can choose. I usually test for IgG. You can also test IgE if you want, or IgA, I believe. So the IgG, again, is that delayed reaction that has more of these kind of, I can't think of the word. Anyway, just weird symptoms that come in from nowhere. Sorry, brain fart. So it has more of these amorphous symptoms, I suppose. That's kind of halfway what I was going for there. I think you know what I mean. Difficult to correlate. Anyway, and I've actually seen some of these tests being advertised. I see them online being advertised, and I haven't looked into them enough to see if they are actually testing IgG. It's a home test kit that you can do, and you can send it in. But there's a lot of issues with food allergy tests in general, or food sensitivity tests, even from naturopaths, right? Because we've learned that food intolerances are not going to show up at all, right? Because we're only testing antibody antigen reactions for a food sensitivity test. I do recommend them if people really need a jumping off point, if they're very hesitant about changing their diet and they need to see it in black and white on a piece of paper. Okay, great, go ahead, we'll do the food sensitivity. It will give them a starting point. But I'm very careful to explain that is not the end-all, be-all of figuring out what you're sensitive to or intolerant to food-wise. And the tests are not always accurate. I like to say they're about 80% accurate, where they will miss a few things. They usually catch big ones, or they will tell you you're reactive to things when you're not. And I think people really want it to be like, wow, this is it. This is all I have to worry about. No problem from here on out. And that's just not true. There are people that have very significant intolerances that do not show up on this food sensitivity testing at all, because it's not testing for the correct response for people. So yeah, so it's kind of frustrating that way, where there's not, the end all be all of tests for people. And again, this sensitivity testing is probably about $160, maybe up to $200. Getting the skin test at the allergist depends on your insurance coverage, right? I've heard, $300, $500, $800 to get that done. And to me, that is the least useful of any, unless you're worried about a potential hypersensitivity reaction, right? That is valuable to understand that. But again, it's very rare, and usually people have those figured out by the time when they're kids, when that happens. So the food sensitivity test has a limited and very specific application, but again, knowing it's not the end-all be-all is really important. And then testing for food intolerance. This one is tough because it's the one that's just kind of, I don't know, you really have to do some hard work on your own there. There's not a great test. That being said, there is something called Carroll testing, which will, it is a type of blood test. It's very specific. It was developed by a naturopath, O.G. Carroll, around the turn of the century. There are not many people that practice this testing method. I have had patients do it and have found massive success with it. So they do have a method for testing intolerances, which I find really interesting. But you do have to find a practitioner that's specially trained in that testing. And you can look up Carroll testing. I will put that in the resource notes below as well for you. But the main thing we want to do, usually, for intolerances and sensitivities is the elimination diet. So that is usually the best way to go, because at that point we're taking things out that are most likely irritating, and then we're getting this inflammation, this chronic inflammation level down, and your symptoms should come down if they are affected by foods. So that is usually what I like to recommend most of all, and it's free, so it's fabulous that way. And by the way, if you have sensitivities come up in this or in this, guess what? You're not going to be eating them anyway. So it all leads to the same path. The elimination diet is done a little bit differently, which we'll certainly talk about as well. That's more part 2 of the series, is how to do the elimination diet. Because there's a lot of things we want to talk about how to do that correctly and good for you. And I just wanted to mention, I did put in one extra thing. It's called NATE. I'll put a link to that, or a little description of what it actually is. Someone's last name who I can't pronounce. Allergy elimination testing. So that is another way to test, and it's a test and a treatment all in one. And again, that's a very specific practitioner. They need to be trained in it, but I've also found that very, very helpful for people as well. So that's really lovely. Okay. Let's see. So, can these reactions be healed? I think that's a really common kind of question, right? It's like, man, I've got all this stuff going on. I might have some food sensitivities and intolerances. Like, am I stuck with these for life? Am I going to be avoiding these foods forever? And as my mentor told me, any good naturopath will answer most questions, it depends. Which is very frustrating, I understand, on your end, but hear me out. And by the way, I have been on the receiving end of that question many times from my own naturopath, so I get it. But it depends, because we're all so individual and unique. It depends on, what our overall body burden of environmental allergens and toxins and food intolerances and allergies are, right? That's a big part of it. It depends on, in naturopathic medicine, we talk about our vital force, which is our own innate ability to heal, right? And that changes as we age, that changes as we have traumas in our life that we deal with or that we don't deal with. That all affects our healing potential, our innate healing potential. So that depends on, how quickly you heal or if you heal. And then if you have an intolerance and you simply don't have the machinery to break things down, that's not something you're going to heal. You're not going to heal a lactose intolerance. You are going to heal your GI by removing dairy and not having it irritated anymore if you are lactose intolerant. But it's not something that, if you quit eating dairy and then you can try it again in 6 months, it'll be different, right? Because you're just lacking in that machinery. So it's very muddled and up and down, much like the world of food allergies in general. But that's okay, because it's this massive self-discovery process of understanding, what are you sensitive to? What are you intolerant to? What's happening with these symptoms that may have been here for years and that now are gone and I feel so much better, right? There's a lot of questions that can be answered looking into food allergies, sensitivities, intolerances that way. And it depends is a good thing, right? We're not cookbooks. It's not A plus B equals C, and that's really kind of a Western medicine outlook. It's very convenient and feels good to have that reassurance, but knowing that you are a unique individual and that you have to learn how to work with you and your body is awesome, because you are an expert on your body, and that's what this process teaches you, is to trust in that and to understand what it's telling you. And that's the greatest gift of all. That's what I hope for all of my patients, to be able to do that and understand what their body is telling them, how to listen. Okay. All right, yes, and I already kind of said this, but I'll say it again. Your best bet is the elimination diet, right? And that is what we're going to dive into in our next video, how to do the elimination diet. Because it's not as simple as just taking things out. There's a way to do it, and there's a way not to do it, and that's actually what we'll cover in the third video, is the common mistakes I see people make while on the elimination diet. Don't be too afraid. It's not super scary. It's totally doable. We'll talk about strategies and ways to do it. I'm not just gonna like throw you out there and say, go ahead and do it. There's a lot that you can kind of, that you can build up a skill set around to make it a better and easier process for you. Okay, well that's it for today. Thanks so much for watching. Just a quick little end note here. I forgot to mention the books that I really like in case you guys are really interested in reading up a little bit more on your own for some more resources about food allergies, food intolerances, and food sensitivities. So Coping with Food Intolerances is a pretty easy book to get into. It's pretty friendly. I really like it. Its author is a naturopath, and he does a fabulous job of explaining how we look at the body and how the naturopathic philosophy really plays into looking at food allergies and why you might have them, food sensitivities, intolerances, that type of thing. So it's very approachable. He also has some recipes at the end of the book. I haven't really tried out the recipes in this one. They seem pretty simple and basic, which can be great. But I actually have a few other books that I prefer for the recipes. I haven't really given this one a fair shot, but the other ones I really like that I will share with you in my next video. And then this one, the food allergies and food intolerances, this is a little more in-depth, pretty scientific kind of read for all of those you guys who really like a lot of detail. It has a slightly different take on things than the Coping with Food Intolerances, but fabulous, fabulous resource. Not so much focused on like approachability and then also diet suggestions at the end, but a ton of really awesome information in case you want to dive in there and learn some more. And I'll certainly put the links to these below the video as well. Okay, thanks so much. Take care. Look at this stack of stuff this week. I mean, it's gonna be like 25 pages. I think I need to invest in double stick tape because I use so much of it.